Hi Matilda. Matilda Amundsen Bergström is a postdoc in comparative literature at the University of Gothenburg and a guest researcher in philosophy at the University of Copenhagen. She's currently working on the research project A Happy Life, Women's Moral Philosophy in the 17th and 18th century Scandinavia. And she will present a talk on Hedvig Charlotta Nordenflycht and The Happy Life in 18th century Sweden. So the floor is yours. Thank you, Matilda.
Thank you. I will try to share my screen with you. There, and okay, can you see it now? Is that fine? Great. Okay, so this is very, very early modern then, 18th century. And I'll just get right to it since we're a bit behind time. So Hedvig Charlotta Nordenflycht and the Happy Life in 18th century Sweden. In the 1744 poem, Important Questions to a Scholar, Swedish poet Hedvig Charlotta Nordenflycht invokes four somewhat unexpected muses to aid her poetic endeavor. And she writes, in my English translation, "If Newton, Leibniz, Locke, and Bale still walked upon this mortal earth, they would be called upon to give relief and cure this doubting soul. They would then have to offer remedy for minds infected with their doubt. Now they've revealed our sickly blindness, but not found any antidote. Is it not better to be ill and to be blind to one's own pains than it is to burn in scorching fire without the slightest bit of use?" So in this passage, Nordenflycht describes how Newton, Leibniz, Locke, and Bale, sort of poster names of anti-dogmatic Enlightenment philosophy, have revealed her old beliefs in traditional authorities to be untenable, the result of a sickly blindness, as she puts it. But the remedy of Enlightenment philosophy seems to have given rise to a new illness for which these men have found no antidote, the illness of doubt. Where will Newton's, Leibniz, Locke's, and Bale's philosophical theories lead mankind? How can we live good and happy lives in a world devoid of unquestionable authorities and truths? And is it even desirable to be enlightened if that leads to a feeling of burning in scorching fire without the slightest bit of use? Now, the happy life, Enlightenment philosophy, and the sometimes precarious relationship between the two preoccupied Nordenflycht throughout her long poetic career, which began in 1742 and lasted until her death in 1763. And most strikingly, once per decade, she returned to this topic in what became 3 longer poems. All were addressed to male intellectuals, and 2, or possibly all 3, took as their point of departure contemporary English or continental publications. So in the 1744 poem, Important Questions to a Scholar, addressed to Danish author Ludvig Holberg, Nordenflycht discusses the theological implications of John Locke's essay concerning human understanding. In the 1754 poem Verse Epistle to Kriton, addressed to Swedish academic Carl Klingenberg, she deliberates over reason and education, seemingly against the backdrop of Jean-Jacques Rousseau's 1750 discourse on the sciences and arts. And in the 1761 poem The Defense of Women, against Jean-Jacques Rousseau, citizen of Geneva, Nordenflycht critiques Rousseau's views on women as they are presented in his 1758 Lettres sur le spectacle. And in the process, she constructs an argument for women's right to participate in a happy and prosperous society. So ostensibly, these poems deal with sort of different topics, but they share an underlying concern about how contemporary philosophy can refigure the meaning of a good and happy life. And Nordenflycht doesn't develop a consistent theory of happiness in these poems, but I will try to show today that from different perspectives and in relation to various concerns and theories, she does engage profoundly and in her own context, often quite pioneeringly, with the classic philosophical topic that is the happy life. But before exploring how, since she is perhaps a bit unfamiliar to some of you, I'll just provide a brief background on Nordenflycht and her context. So important questions to a scholar and the defense of women. Two of these poems I'll talk about today. They were written at either end of Nordenflycht's remarkably successful career as professional poet. She was born in 1718 into the low nobility and embarked on her career in 1744, having both married and become a widow the year before. And unlike in India, becoming a widow in 18th century Sweden enabled you to do more things than you would otherwise have been able to do. But she was only the second woman in Sweden to print a collection of poetry. But nonetheless, she went on to publish hundreds of poems in genres spanning from occasional to lyrical, historical, and philosophical. And she also contributed significantly to 5 poetry collections published by the learned society, the Thought Builders, Tankebyggarna, of which she became the only female member in 1753. And this was really one of the important forums for Enlightenment philosophy or 18th century philosophy in Sweden during her lifetime. And so just to give you a sense of the amount, I've posted, these are her poetry collections. The ones at the bottom are the Thought Builders poetry collections and some of her long poems that were printed separately as well. So just to give you a sense of the amount and the sort of consistency with which she published for about 2 decades. And in 1752, Nordenflycht received a yearly pension from Parliament equaling a civil servant's income in recognition for her literary achievements. And she spent the remainder of her life as, I would argue, actually the most successful Swedish poet to date. And as important questions to a scholar exemplify, Nordenflycht began to engage with contemporary philosophy really from the early days of her career. And in the Swedish context, her poems were quite often trailblazing, introducing philosophical theories that radically broke with general Swedish viewpoints that were most significantly, of course, impacted by a very strong and powerful Lutheran state church. And this also led to the fact that in Sweden, women did not partake in cultural and public life in the 18th century in the same way as they did in France and England. There are very few in the first half of the 18th century, except for Nordenflycht. It's not until later in the 18th century, around the 1770s or so, that we do see increasing numbers of women beginning to make their voices heard. But none, however, engaged with philosophy in the same way that Nordenflycht did already in 1744, with important questions to a scholar, which I will now turn to. So important questions to a scholar mimics an epistolary exchange between Nordenflycht, who speaks in the poem's first section, called The Questions, and Holberg, who speaks in a second section, which is called The Reply. And it is possible that Holberg and Nordenflycht had an actual correspondence about the topics broached in the poem, but no such letters remain, and it is very clear from the structure of the poem that Nordenflycht has adapted any hypothetical raw material into a poem that offers 2 distinct and different perspectives. And since The Questions is presented as giving Nordenflycht's perspective, I'll focus on that today. Now, the questions referred to in the poem's title are not explicitly about happiness, but they do concern the meaning of a good life. And Nordenflycht presents them as follows, and this is the quote up on your screen now. And she says, "If it is true, as Locke has said, that God can give unto all matter the ability and force to think, which means there cannot be a spirit, it must be his concluding thought that what we call the soul and spirit is apt to fall apart at death, and end as mortal life does end. If virtue too is not a thing, if it owns no essence in itself, but only in this worldly realm consists in the commands of habit, what is the point of being virtues, and check our wishes and desires, if there is not a rightful power that judges justly good from bad? Is the soul immaterial and immortal, or material and mortal? And does virtue emanate from an omnipotent God, or does it simply consist of human habit? If the latter is true, what is really the meaning and basis of morality? All right, so these questions that explicitly derive from Nordenflycht's reading of Locke go to the very heart of the Lutheran worldview. And as literary scholar Helene Blomqvist has argued, in the Swedish context, merely bringing them up was radical. Yet throughout this poem, Nordenflycht focuses less on the veracity of what she takes to be Locke's propositions, and more on their possible implications for her and her fellow men's happiness. And as is clear in the quote with which I began today, Nordenflycht underscores that philosophy such as Locke's has not furthered her efforts to achieve enlightened happiness. Instead, philosophy has led to anxious doubt. And as she puts it in a later passage directly addressed to Holberg, and this is on the screen now. Behold, all proof of your wisdom has long pleased the tormented mind, which is prey to its own thoughts, and cannot find peace or stillness. It runs wildly around the world, pursuing light and clarity. It wants to find constant enjoyment, but cannot find peace in anything. So here, Nordenflycht draws attention to what we might call the emotional cost, what has been called an 18th century crisis of judgment, stemming from this philosophical critique of conventional authorities and truths. So though Nordenflycht has turned to philosophy to find light and clarity, as she calls it, as well as constant enjoyment, the uncertainty that follows when old belief systems are overturned has led instead to torment and an inability to find peace in anything. So here then, Nordenflycht seems to suggest that while Enlightenment thinkers claim to contribute to the happiness of all by doing away with old prejudice, because such doing away leads to uncertainty concerning the meaning of a good life, it can become detrimental rather than conducive to happiness. And this conflict between philosophy and happiness is even more pronounced in a pretty striking passage when Nordenflycht expresses her envy of credulous believers and radical materialists alike. And we have that now. And she writes, "Happy the man who is comforted by religion learnt in childhood years, who believes simply in the belief that best will lead to blissfulness, that father and grandfather shared, and is never tempted by any doubt, but is fortified in times of need when he can to the Bible turn. Happy the man who here, as much he can, satisfies his base desires, denying our world's originator, does not fret over penance or liability, lives contently here on earth, when others sigh in great distress. If his soul dissolves at death, he has not lacked prior pleasure. But full of sorrow is the man who does not amongst his many thoughts find for himself a firm foundation, cannot fall back on certitude, whose solace seeks in God and virtue, but fears that he deceives himself and falls into the worst distress." So here, Nordenflycht deliberates on the potential of traditional religious faith, atheism, and her own skeptical middle position, concluding that while both the naive religious man and the atheist can be happy, the moderate cannot, since he or she cannot fall back on certitude. And interestingly here, I mean, the poet seems to allude to the three-front struggle between conservatives, radicals, and moderates that Jonathan Israel so famously has cast as a central philosophical phenomenon of the early 18th century. And so from that perspective, Nordenflycht places herself right in the middle of European philosophical debates. In her Swedish context, however, and its apparent appreciation of some aspects of atheism, this passage is strikingly radical. And reasonably, Nordenflycht is not trying to say that atheism is a tenable alternative to Lutheran faith. But it is noteworthy that she views it as a more foolproof route to happiness than moderate attempts to reconcile Enlightenment thought and religion. Because atheists, like conservatives, can be happy because they enjoy the certitude denied all who find themselves unable to draw definite conclusions from philosophy. And as such, they are safe from what Nordenflycht calls the ailment of doubt. Yet, though it seems to have brought her only misery, Nordenflycht considers a moderate position her only tenable option. And she makes this explicit towards the end of the section, the questions, when turning directly to Holberg to ask him for advice. And then she says, this is the last quote of this poem: "How will I work this problem out? Who can shed light on all my darkness? Forgive that I seek out the one who never falters in his thoughts, but who has found a middle road, a steady pathway for his thought, wherefore it never seems to lose neither faith nor wit's conclusion." So a moderate position that can harbor both philosophy and faith is clearly Nordenflycht's ideal. I mean, this is one that she shares with Holberg and Locke as well, I guess. But to her, that position seems irreconcilable with happiness because it leads to unceasing uncertainty concerning the meaning of a good life. So thus, though she claims that in theory, Enlightenment philosophy can lead to happiness, more strikingly in this poem, Nordenflycht underscores how existentially precarious enlightened life risked becoming. Now, 10 years after the publication of Important Questions to a Scholar, Nordenflycht returned to this difficult relationship between Enlightenment thought and happiness with the poem Verse Epistle to Kriton, to which she adds the very lengthy subtitle, you have it on the screen here, over the question, which contributes most to man's happiness and peace, knowledge or ignorance, and had man profited most from the arts being invented or not? And this poem is addressed to a fellow member of the learned society, the Thought Builders. And the subtitle's questions seem to allude to Rousseau's 1750 discourse about arts and sciences. And there is a scholar, Gardar Salberg, who has pointed out several stanzas in the poem that seem to paraphrase both Rousseau's discourse and King Stanislaus' reply to that discourse from 1751. Both these texts Nordenflycht owned at the time of her death in 1763, but we don't know when she got them, and she doesn't mention Rousseau explicitly in this poem, so it's unclear if it builds on him or just resembles his writing. Well, be that as it may, Nordenflycht begins her poem with pointing out that Klingenberg, or Kriton as she calls him, believes that the arts and sciences have contributed to the betterment of human beings. And first, she really seems to agree with this, and she writes, and this is my translation again: "Yes, you are right, I see your reason. To think wisely and to do well is one and same and should not be separated. The more distinguished the reason, the more virtuous the will. And thus it is a human duty of the very greatest weight to nurture the soul's faculties." So here Klingenberg's position is summarized. Enlightened reason procured by the right form of education inevitably results in virtue. So therefore, to live good and happy lives, people must receive an education and be saved from ignorance. And these lines echo King Stanislaus' critique of Rousseau, but they reasonably also allude to Christian Wolff, that was really Klingenberg's big hero. And this opinion would have been the general opinion too in Sweden, as it was in many parts of Europe in the 1750s. But further on in Verse Epistle to Kriton, it turns out that Nordenflycht has a more ambiguous view on the relationship between education, virtue, and happiness. And she writes, "The majority in delightful peace never come to know that duty. Perhaps they are, however, happier. For Kriton is knowledge not a source, whose stream, however clear and pure, holds water that is both sweet and bitter. And who should be thought the luckiest, one who desirously quench their thirst, or one who never thirsts at all?" So not most people, Nordenflycht points out, live peacefully and happily without fulfilling their duty to educate themselves. And in this passage, Nordenflycht shifts emphasis from social mores to happiness. And so in some ways, she kind of anticipates Rousseau's second discourse on inequality, where he also deliberates more on happiness. And in relation to this happiness, Nordenflycht makes a similar point as she does in Important Questions to a Scholar. Knowledge, she claims, can be both sweet and bitter. It can be conducive to happiness, since it fulfills the human desire to understand the nature of things. But it can also be conducive to misery, because knowledge creates a potentially endless thirst for more knowledge. The uneducated, on the other hand, feel no privation and run no risk of becoming unhappy. So even if Nordenflycht builds on Rousseau, we can see that she's also developing thoughts that she had much earlier, 10 years earlier. And this theme then is developed throughout the poem. And I just wanted to give you one more rather striking example. It's the second passage on the screen now, where Nordenflycht dwells on the happiness of what she calls most human beings. And then she writes, "To till the soil satisfies most human beings. They fulfill modest wishes with little effort. Ignorance interprets what few needs there are. And if many virtues are unknown to the savages, many vices too seem to be non-existent. It is difficult to see who does best in this respect. Virtue and vice are mostly judged by habit, as we do well to recall that the highest good of man consists of health, peace, and nurture." So as Sahlberg has pointed out, Nordenflycht's claim that the happiness of man is primarily found in health, peace, and nurture, and not in education, probably alludes to Alexander Pope's essay on man, where he expresses a similar point. And interestingly, Nordenflycht also argues here that while savages, as she calls them, may live less virtuously than enlightened Europeans, they also show fewer vices, making it hard to argue that education contributes to a good society. And so, this claim that really quite anticipates Rousseau's not yet written second discourse is in clear opposition to Klingenberg's views. But when Nordenflycht concludes her argument, she's nonetheless markedly ambivalent. And she writes, and this is my final quote and the end of the poem, "I arrive at the conclusion that wit and art and effort breeds uncertainty, want, and unhappiness. But Kriton, I still want to approve your thesis. Nowadays, it is an aspect of every learned world to be fortified by knowledge. Since one now has begun to practice arts, one must seek happiness in their rightful use, as one no longer can hear nature's voice. But Kriton, medicine would be unwarranted had disease not created need." So here Nordenflycht concludes, as she did in Important Questions to a Scholar, that knowledge is potentially injurious to happiness because it breeds uncertainty. But Nordenflycht doesn't really reject Klingenberg's position. Instead, she adds a caveat. Since what she calls the voice of nature has been silenced with the introduction of arts and sciences, the original route to happiness has been lost. Therefore, our only viable option is to strengthen ourselves with rightfully used knowledge, thereby adjusting our lives to be in accordance with nature as best we can perceive it. But, as Nordenflycht concludes, with what really seems to be a paraphrase of Rousseau's first discourse, knowledge is medicine for an ailment that need not have existed. So in Verse Epistle to Kriton, as an Important Questions to a Scholar then, Nordenflycht's views on the relationship between knowledge and happiness are deeply ambivalent. But interestingly, this is about to change as we move on to the final poem of the day, and from individual happiness to the happy society. So in 1761, Nordenflycht published her last major poem, The Defense of Women, explicitly written as a critique of Rousseau's 1758 Lettres sur le spectacle. In this letter, Rousseau contends, among other things, that women's education and participation in public life through use of that education was ruinous for society. In The Defense of Women, Nordenflycht strongly condemns this view, arguing instead that a happy society was one where women had both the possibility and the right to partake in public and professional life. So in this poem, Nordenflycht has shifted her emphasis from individual to social or societal happiness. And moreover, for the first time, she now considers the effects of gender on human happiness. And in doing so, she composes what is incomparably the most radical text on women's rights to be published in 18th century Sweden, one of the earliest critiques of Rousseau written by a European woman that I know of as well. So in relation to happiness, Nordenflycht's most important argument is that to bar women from public life is to willfully disregard a means through which society can be made happier. As she expresses it in the two passages that you have on the screen now, both from the opening of this poem. So first she says, "Our sexist rights have seen such autocratic treatment, transformed at times to God, at times into a maggot, yet always in accord with one severe decree to keep us from the light and bar from high pursuits." And a little later she returns to the same topic, saying, "So female drive is bound by upbringing and habit to vie amongst themselves to see who is more stupid. With ignorance the yoke they bear as ornament. For it's a woman's shame to be well-read and wise. O cruel tyranny, how can our world grow better, when half mankind is bound in ignorance and fettered, and lack of brains displayed in occupations and pursuits?" And this is translated by Alain Crozier from Swedish. So to prohibit women from partaking in light and high pursuits is, Nordenflycht contends, tyrannical. And as many researchers have argued, the phrase light and high pursuits reasonably refers to education and some sort of public offices or civil service. So interestingly, as Nordenflycht shifts her focus from individual happiness to the happy society, her hesitancy concerning education seems to have disappeared. I guess arguably, she believed that no matter the existential dangers associated with knowledge, women should still have the right to pursue it. But Nordenflycht's primary concern in the defense of women isn't education. It is that for the good of society, women should be allowed to partake in high pursuits and what is in the second quote called occupations. So two words or two concepts that allude to public offices and civil service. And it is in relation to this claim that the words tyranny and autocratic are very meaningful. So they might allude to Lockean political theory, according to which one of the features of tyranny is, of course, the disregard of public good. But to Swedish readers, they also invoke the Caroline autocracy, which ended in 1718 and was, according to official Swedish accounts, replaced by the Age of Liberty, Frihetstiden, a period of liberty and progress and happiness that was still ongoing when Nordenflycht wrote her defense. So arguably, Nordenflycht's claim here is that to refuse women an education and keep them from using that education in public pursuits is to disregard the public good and impede the development of a happy society, something that we thought we had left behind with the Caroline autocracy. And towards the end of this quotation, the second quotation, this point is even made explicit as Nordenflycht questions how our world, the Swedish world, is ever to be improved by women's ignorance, while a lack of brains is displayed in all sorts of occupations. So to deny women their right to participate in public life is directly detrimental to the improvement of society. And versions of this argument reappears throughout the defense of women, and I'll just give you a couple more examples before I wrap this up. And one is a passage where Plato's Republic is presented as a model society. And there Nordenflycht writes, "Plato too explained our rights when he displayed his visions of a state with wise and happy people, where laws and thoughts were pure and free from all abuses. He shares honor and occupations between two sexes." So in that passage, Nordenflycht tightly connects, or claims that Plato did so, women's rights, a happy society, and a gender-neutral division of labor. And this statement is then followed by a host of exemplary women who, for the good of their societies, have demonstrated public virtues and performed public functions that were generally considered the exclusive attributes of men. And to conclude that list, Nordenflycht turns to a category that's really important to her, and that is queens. And she writes in the second quote here, "You heroines who had a grand and precious occupation, for all your people through your wise, courageous rule, you have enhanced your thrones, brought fortune to great nations, preserved in memory, adorned by hands of glory." And importantly, of course, in 18th century Sweden, queens, especially ruling ones, were the only women who could be seen as holding some form of public offices. So they thus demonstrated that women's abilities to do so were not just theoretical or a thing of the distant past. And this point is then driven home by a long list of exemplary queens and details about their contributions to the betterment of their respective societies. And though not spelled out, Nordenflycht's conclusion is quite easy to deduce. Queens demonstrate that women, if given the chance, are just as able as men to contribute to the betterment of society by participating in public and professional life. And for the benefit of all, they should be allowed to do so. So in the defense of women, it seems like Nordenflycht has recast herself as something of an Enlightenment enthusiast. So unlike in Important Questions to a Scholar and Verse Epistle to Kriton, she's here remarkably optimistic about the potential of education and progress and the possibility to create a good and happy society through the displacement of old gender prejudice. And arguably, this is an effect of the shift of perspective from individual to society. It could also, I think, be related to gender. I think that when reading Lettres sur le spectacle, Nordenflycht perhaps perceived that if Rousseau's views were generally acknowledged, the democratic potential of certain strands of Enlightenment thought would not be brought to bear on women's situation. I think that however existentially precarious such Enlightenment thought seemed to her, this was arguably a political risk that Nordenflycht, who had labored all her life in the public arena from which Rousseau sought to exclude women, just couldn't accept. And just to finish up, in a poem written shortly after her death, Nordenflycht is celebrated as an heir to both Socrates and Sappho. And this is one of several indications that in her own day, Nordenflycht was, in some ways at least, recognized as a philosopher as well as a poet. And I've tried to demonstrate here today that even though she doesn't publish any conventional philosophical treatises or develops any clear theories, she does engage with and develop a complex understanding of the happy life that considers both individual and social happiness, as well as both risks and possibilities of Enlightenment thought, and that relates happiness to theological, pedagogical, and political concerns. So though she expressed such uncertainty about the potential of philosophy, in that respect at least, Nordenflycht's poems are a powerful testament to the multifaceted nature of 18th century philosophies of happiness. Thank you very much.